Hey everybody, Eric from Dead Tech here, and I need a haircut, but don't worry, I will be doing that soon. But in the meantime, let's record a video of reader question roundups. And in this particular video, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I've gone not so much in prepared answers, but figured out where context was necessary for you to understand the questions a little bit more, so look forward to that as an improvement. Today I'm going to be talking about a few different topics, and if any of that sounds interesting and you like this format, please stay tuned. So with that said, let's take a look at the reader questions. All right, let's take a look at the first reader question, which has to do with whether generalizing or dabbling can lead to unexpectedly great results. And this is in response to a blog post that I wrote, and I'm looking at it over here, called Software Career Anti-Patterns, Career Development by Coincidence. And I will link to this post in the notes, but basically the idea here was I took a tweet somebody had said that was kind of controversial, and she had said that like speaking at conferences wasn't maybe such a great idea, and I sort of expanded on this a bit in a more nuanced take to say that like it can be, but all too often software developers don't do it with any real sense of purpose. So instead of having something that is like intentional for their career, they just do the conference speaking thing is what amounts to being a hobby, even though we tell ourselves it is in our career's interest. And so I think of this as programming, or as being akin to programming by coincidence, as like career development by coincidence. I'm going to go speak ... profit. So I wrote a blog post kind of explaining this at length, and one of the comments in response to this point is from Marcos, who says, "This is a great point. I really believe that focusing on the outcome is important, but I'm curious to know if you don't believe that increasing your knowledge in different areas might cause unexpected great results. For example, Steve Jobs learning typography helped him to develop a better UI for Apple products." As an aside, I did not know that Steve Jobs knew typography, and that is interesting. So in the post, I'm kind of talking at length about how if you're going to do things like conference speaking, lay out a plan where they're going to help your career, or don't. But if you don't, understand that what we're talking about here is a hobby rather than a first-class career play. It's not professional, I guess I would say, in the sense of like, serving your professional interests. So in this regard, I'm gathering that maybe Steve Jobs learned about typography as sort of a hobby or an interest.
I'm really glad you liked everything, but there is one more thing.
And then there's this idea that cross-breeding, if you will, a hobby with a career might lead to an absolute home run. So what is my take on that? First of all, thank you for pointing that out. It's kind of interesting. And secondly, I will say that, of course, blending something that's a hobby or a different interest of yours with your actual professional interest can certainly lead to great results. But the way I'm going to answer this question is to say that I think, that being said, that it can lead to great results. Not to be flippant, but so can playing the lottery. And that doesn't really have anything to do with your career. You go out, you buy a lottery ticket, the stuff happens, and profit. And wow, what a great, home run. That, like I said, is a bit flippant, but it kind of goes to hyperbole to illustrate a point, which is that, sure, you might fuse some disparate skills together, you might dabble or be a generalist, dilettante, whatever, and that could lead to a great result. There's no doubt about it. But if I were a betting person, I wouldn't really bet on the lottery, or I wouldn't bet on roulette or what have you. I think of staging things kind of intentionally through your career and making plays like that in a specialized context is more of a house / blue chip play. So if you lay out a pattern where you're going to go speak at software conferences in a very career-minded way, and you have actual goals, for what you want those speaking engagements to bring you back, that is more like being the house, and on a long timeline, you are pretty likely to win versus going and doing something, learning typography or scuba diving or something. It might be that you do this whole like programming, scuba diving, typography fusion, and it leads to, you being the next Steve Jobs. But more likely what it's going to lead to is that 9 to 5 you're a programmer who scuba dives and or does typography in your spare time, and those things never actually synergize in any meaningful way. So that's my answer to the question. Do I believe that it could lead to unexpected results? Sure. But I believe that it will lead to them less predictably and more erratically than if you kind of structured your career in a very deliberate fashion. All right, question 2, and this one is a little bit more involved, but the gist of this is, doesn't giving expert advice require hands-on experience? Hello, Eric. I have a question for you regarding your advice for every programmer to become a consultant. Quick pause here. I did write a blog post that I'll link to, why every software developer should be a consultant. And in this, I talk about software development is knowledge work. So instead of viewing ourselves as laborers, we should really view ourselves as experts and start to think about what kind of knowledge we have that people would pay for. And in this post, I also talk about kind of 4 stages of problem solving in the knowledge work context. And there's a link to the world of medicine here, which is I talk about that there is diagnosis, then there's prescription of a therapy, application of the therapy, and then reapplication of the therapy. And I will explain this more in a bit, and it's not originally my concept, but that is what the reader is referring to in this question, which I'm going to resume reading now. So I have a question regarding your advice for every programmer to aim to be a consultant and to be the one diagnosing and prescribing rather than applying the solution. For me personally, in order to be able to be the one that gives advice on how a problem should be tackled, diagnosis or prescription, first, I should have tackled the problem myself and gathered the experience and confidence to help others. Let me use a simple example. Let's say I want to help people set up their service on AWS. That's my niche. Bad example, but bear with me. As an aside, he's referring to the fact that I probably wouldn't personally consider that to be a good niche. But that's a different reader question. I personally just can't start doing that by reading about it and learning about it. I need to have done that and have at least some experience in it so that I can see what can go wrong, etc. Gather some confidence, like in your case, referring to me, Eric, where you did something for quite some time before you were able to start consulting on it. My question is how someone with 3.5 years of experience of being a generalist can follow your advice in finding a niche and transitioning to getting paid for diagnosis and prescribing. The way I see it, I have to have spent time in the trenches working on the chosen niche until I have enough experience to start consulting for it. Thank you for your time and thoughts. You are welcome. Thank you for asking the question, because this is a pretty interesting topic. So let me dive in a little bit. And first of all, let me challenge the premise here a little bit. Do you really need, in order to talk intelligently about setting up stuff on AWS, do you absolutely need to have done that a lot or at all? And the example I'll offer here is, let's say that your grandparents had some SaaS they had signed up for that like enabled photo sharing and maybe a little Photoshop, or I don't know, maybe they're just using Instagram or something to share photos with their grandchildren and of their grandchildren and whatnot. And then let's say somebody put a bug in their ear that was like, hey, there's this AWS thing. You should really get more granular control, grandma and grandpa, over your photos. And so your grandparents came to you and they said, hey, I've been hearing about this AWS thing. You know, what do you think? You could say, look, I'm going to stop you right there. Don't do that. You don't need to have ever migrated anything to AWS in order to know that that's probably not the best idea. You could just be anybody vaguely associated with like software and DevOps or whatever. So you don't need any real experience to be able to give advice, and even helpful advice at that. You generally probably just need to know and have a decent knowledge gap between yourself and the people that you're talking to. And so, you want to be, if you're, consulting and doing something of value, you have to know more, and you also have to be like offering actual valuable advice, which in this case you would be if your grandparents were going to go spend a bunch of time and money trying to figure out AWS in order to do something they didn't need it for. You would be saving them time and money. So that is valuable advice. Now, if you don't believe me on this count, stop and consider the world of software, and stop and consider just how many people are out there with titles like project manager and program manager who are either 1, non-technical, or 2, who are never technical, and yet they are kind of the strategy arm of the product, or of the project. To get back to what I was talking about, they're kind of doing the diagnosis and prescription. So let me get into diagnosis and prescription a little bit and talk through that medical metaphor. So in general, when we think of like projects or problem solutions in the knowledge work space, I'm going to walk through the example of a doctor where there is prescription. So you go to the doctor and you say, hey, I've got this kind of shooting pain in my arm when I do certain things. And the doctor says, looks at you, does whatever with the stethoscope, or probably not, but listens to your symptoms and then says, yep, think you pulled a muscle. That is diagnosis.
Not enough butter.
That's it.
Did you just diagnose the oatmeal? You can't just go and diagnose the oatmeal.
If the doctor then says, for a pulled muscle, I recommend you hold the arm relatively immobile for a few days, take some Advil. That is the prescription. So the doctor is diagnosing and prescribing. This is high value knowledge work to you. He's not doing any kind of labor. He's listening to your problem, taking it in, and then offering you expert advice. Next comes the application of the therapy. That's where you, the not knowledge worker in this situation, come in and you start doing labor, specifically taking Advils and holding your arm still. That's the therapy. That is lower value. There is value to it. It is the thing that you execute, which makes your arm feel better, so it's certainly valuable, but it's not as valuable as figuring out the problem so that you stop arm wrestling or whatever. Then there's reapplication of the therapy, which is kind of, if this recurs, you do the same thing again. And these tend to sort of, fall down in a predictably kind of like linearish direction in terms of value. The the diagnosis is the most valuable. Without that, you don't even know what you're doing. Prescription, knowing then how to go about solving it, is probably the next most valuable. The actual solution, third most, because while it is, equally important, it doesn't really require as much knowledge. People have figured out what you should be doing ahead of time and you're just executing it. And then reapplication is kind of the least valuable because you've already kind of even proven through execution what needs to be done. Now you could hand this off to sort of a lower knowledge person in a context where this makes sense. So in the software world, or the IT broader world in general, usually we, as the people who are individual contributors kind of executing this, we jump right in at the labor stage, application of the therapy. So you get transferred onto some project and it's a, React this and a .NET that and blah, blah, blah. All this has been predetermined and you just get in there and you start applying that therapy. You are laboring. In this case, it's all the project and program and line and manager this and manager that. All these people have kind of gotten together and they've gone off into a room and they've diagnosed the business's problem, which is that, we need a better line of business solution to distributing orders. And they have decided upon a therapy, a prescription, which is we're going to build this internal web app and it's going to be great. We're going to use these technologies because we have these developer resources and yada, yada. And then they call you in to do the therapy, to apply it. So let's look now at what's going on here and then kind of look back at the idea of set up a service on AWS as a niche. Because, if we're talking about a niche isn't quite the same thing as a specialty, and setting things up on AWS might be like a specialty. It might be what you're good at, but that doesn't make it a niche because honestly, putting things on AWS is application of a therapy. It is not a diagnosis and a prescription. Nobody would come to you and there wouldn't be a world where somebody said something to you and you said I've got this diagnosis for you. It is, I'm going to do labor. You are jumping from something to the labor. So when you talk about this as a niche and you think about offering consultative expert advice, that is incongruent with the tactical application of taking something and putting it on AWS. So what might have happened in advance of this is a discussion that maybe you're not involved in, which is how do I know if I might save money by going to AWS? Or how do I know if my application might become more reliable by going to AWS? So the expert advice here that you would be offering is that you are not doing things around or advising about this procedure, but rather whether the procedure is necessary or not. So the way that you would get to be in the prescriptive and diagnostic area of things is to develop knowledge, not so much about how and the nitty gritty of putting stuff on AWS, but why people do that. What pains do they have that cause them to do that? When is that a good diagnosis? When is that an appropriate treatment for the pain and not sort of a mismanaged set of therapy? So it's really developing that knowledge. Now, if I go back and answer the question, how do you take all this generalist software development knowledge and turn it into something where you could be an actual expert, a consultant, doing diagnosis and prescription, you have to start listening to people's pains. All you've ever been doing up to this point is applying therapies because somebody else has told you to. You need to start understanding the pains that lead to that application of therapy being the right thing to do. And once you start doing that, you do not really necessarily need to have that hands-on experience. Like, to go back and circle this out by maybe being just a little bit obtuse, but like, if we go back to the doctor example, do you think the doctor needs to spend 3 years immobilizing his arm and eating Advils in order to be able to diagnose a pulled muscle?
Tastes like crap. What else you got? Go right ahead. Help yourself.
No, of course not. So laboring and practice laboring isn't really good practice for strategic consideration and diagnosis and prescription. They might overlap. As you're doing all that laboring, you might start to develop some knowledge of the pains that lead to this, but they are not really all that related. So that is a very long answer to this question, but I think it's a complicated question, and it really cuts to the heart of what a lot of folks ask me in this venue. Moving on now, question 3. This one is easier to have context for because it is actually another question and another comment about that same blog post from question 1. So you've already got all this context. Great. Here is a question from Ishan, and he says, can you discuss more about the shift from hobby to outcome-focused mindset? Maybe an example of something that you or some other developer did. I feel that this is quite close to what a lot of people are saying about branding and marketing, that instead of being a Python developer, one has to be a Python speed optimization expert, etc. An example or a story with more actionable advice should make this clearer. Now, as for how to go from being a Python developer to some kind of Python expert, the closest thing I can think to translate that is maybe my own static analysis practice, but this was a little bit more indirect. It had some years of experience of me being an actual CIO, like a manager, an executive, and consultant in between. But it might be that I had gone from, let's see, years ago, I remember, just as an individual software developer, setting up like static analysis tools and gathering code metrics to help the team move towards clean code. So that would be kind of like the execution, so to speak. But then going to what I've been doing more recently, which is gathering data about code bases and using that data to help executives make decisions about, retiring the code base or whatever. That is more of being a static analysis expert as opposed to an implementer. So that's maybe one example, but the other one I'll give, specifically from like hobby to outcome focused, has to do with my blog, Dead Tech, which is linked to in every one of these descriptions. It'll be down below there as well. And on Dead Tech, for a lot of years, I just wrote a blog, and I picked up followers, and I was flattered, and that was fun. Their numbers grew from the tens to the hundreds to the thousands. And, thousands of people follow that blog, which is really cool. And for a lot of years, I thought like, hey, I'm a really great blogger because I've got these thousands of followers. Check out my analytics. I had this one post that went on to Hacker News and I got like 50,000 views. So this was hobby. And apologies to a lot of you out there who are bloggers that are starting to take a lot of pride in how many page views you get. It sort of, in a way, reminds me of those like South Park hypothetical dollars.
Hi, we made a really successful thing on the internet and I'd like to collect our money.
Take a number and wait with everyone else.
Where you're like, this must mean something great. It's got to be a win for the career. This was my thinking too. Outcome focused, like, what do I actually do with all of those followers? So something goes viral on Reddit. Hey, awesome. Like, a lot of people saw my name, and, a buddy or two of mine wrote to me and was like, cool, you're trending. And then it all goes away, and all those readers go away, and, nobody's actually deposited any money in my pocket. Nobody's offered me a job. Nobody's even offered me a little bitty raise at my current job. Like, it's led to nothing. So I learned a lot about content marketing over the course of time. And I started to consult and depend on Dead Tech for like inbound leads for my consulting practice. And what I realized was that writing posts that went viral on Reddit, I wasn't speaking to potential buyers. I was impressing my peers. And so these numbers on Google Analytics, getting tens of thousands of people reading my posts, these are vanity metrics. It was hobby. It was cool to look at Google Analytics and feel good, but it wasn't getting me an actual outcome. And so the outcome focused mindset would be like, well, okay, what do I actually want to do with this traffic? The easiest play for Dead Tech would be to say, oh, I want to get more of these like code-based assessment gigs. So what I should really be doing is writing blog posts about code-based assessments. And then what I should be measuring is how many people wind up giving me a call and saying, hey, I read this piece on your blog and I want to put you in touch with my manager. Or, hey, I'm a dev manager and I want to hire you to come in and, make some decisions and help my team with this. Those are outcome-focused metrics. So those are kind of a brief personal example and then maybe a more detailed one that really hopefully illustrates the point. You should start with like outcomes that are career related and then kind of work backwards. Because if you're just picking out vanity metrics, you're just saying like, hey, a lot of people are reading my stuff, or hey, 300 people came to my conference talk. So what? Like, what happened next? Something good might have happened. But if it's just kind of this general sense of, well, a lot of people came to my conference talk, so people are super stoked on me, and that's got to be good for my career, right? Like,
thank you, Al Gore. You're super awesome. Excelsior!
I don't know, it might be, but honestly, probably not. It's probably a vanity metric, so take those, and if you're okay with that, I should say, if you're just doing it for the love of the game, you like speaking, you want to, it's like Toastmasters, you want to get good at it, or you like writing, and it's really cool that a lot of people saw, then hey, great. But that is a hobby, it's not career-focused. So there you have it. All right, question 4. This one, finally, here I am looking at it. This one doesn't really require a ton of context. It's just sort of a question for me in my blogging travels in general. Is business software consulting a niche? That's the general question. Hi, Eric. I read one of your blog posts on being a consultant versus being a software engineering laborer. I hope it's not presumptuous to ask, but I'm curious if, quote, business software consulting is a niche, or if that's still way too broad. If this is too broad, could you recommend a good way to narrow that down? Should I learn a specific tool really well? For example, how specific of a niche do the 5-figure per day consultants have? FYI, for my current client, I'm building internal workflow tools, a custom scheduler, migrating datas, and building dashboards with technologies elided, because when people write into me and I'm reading their questions, I make sure to keep them anonymous. So I'm not sure if this particular reader wanted this out there or not. Anyway, so I have elided the technologies, but the rest of this as is. And so what he's talking about here is he's building software that could be described as business consulting software, or business software, I guess. So internal workflow tools, a scheduler, data migration, and then is the niche that I sort of work in this general sort of stuff a good niche. So let me answer this first. How do you become a 5-figure per day consultant? If you find that out, let me know. I mean, that's $10,000 a day. There's 260 working days in the year. So that means as a consultant, you are earning $2.6 million per work year in revenue. I have earned a pretty good wage as a consultant, but never anything close to that. So maybe 4 figures per day is something to shoot for. And if you want to know how to do that, should you get more specific? And should you get more specific on a tool? So let me say this. On my blog, I distinguish between specialty and niche. A specialty is a thing that you get good at, and that might or might not be like orthogonal to whether anyone cares. And so what you're describing here is a specialty. I'm working on these kind of tools. I'm really good at like workflow tools and scheduling tools. That may have market value or it may not. It's just what you happen to do. And it's kind of like resume driven thinking. Like you go through your resume and you're like, all right, yeah, here's this. I like doing it. It's kind of specific. That's not a niche. A niche is when there is a demand for something out there. And it could be anything. Like in the case of what I did with Hit Subscribe, I just noticed that a lot of people wanted me to write blog posts for them. That's a niche. It's not me going through my resume and saying like, well, I have, 6 years of blogging and 5 years of WordPress. So, it's just people saying, hey, I would pay you to do this. And I was saying, oh, interesting. And after enough people told me that, I thought like, hey, I'm a super entrepreneur. Like maybe all these people willing to pay me means there's a business. That's a niche. And so, no, what you're describing is not a niche. It is probably too broad, but it's definitely not a niche because you only have proof that there is one client who is willing to pay you and probably a bunch of other people to develop this custom stuff. So that is a gig. It's not really a niche. In terms of like, let's take a scheduler, for instance, because that's kind of the easiest thing I can speak to off the cuff. And let's say that we're talking about what we have internally at Hit Subscribe, which is this really kind of elaborate scheduling system for blog posts for like 20 simultaneous clients. Now you're starting to maybe think about a niche where let's say you're building this scheduler and let's just say for argument's sake, it's the kind of scheduler for a workflow that's similar to what we're doing with Hit Subscribe and managing all these blog posts. well, maybe Hit Subscribe likes this, and maybe there's a bunch of other content agencies out there as well. Now you're on to something interesting, because you have this experience in not only building a scheduler, but presumably the domain knowledge, like what goes into complex schedulers, what problems do users have with them, what do people complain about, and so on and so forth. So that is kind of like how you might sort of start working toward a niche. Like, you're doing things that are specific, and that's good, but it's not so much what you're doing, it's what the demand is. Like, what pain do people have that these tools are solving? If you start to get to know that pain, and, you know, to go back to the previous question, you're starting to do some diagnosis and prescription of therapy around that. Like, hey, you know, I work with schedulers a lot, and you probably shouldn't be using this one. We built this custom one, and you should do X, Y, and Z. If you start to be able to give advice like that, you're starting to be onto a potential niche. And then if you find that people are willing to pay you for that advice, you're definitely onto a niche. So just to make sure I'm answering the question here, is this too broad? Yes. And it's not really even a niche. How do you narrow it down? Kind of like I said, you start to really look at the demand around these things that you're building. What pains do people have? And then narrow it down based on listening to them. And you could even start kind of just doing informal like market research conversations, or just helping people, you know, reaching out to your clients' clients, if that's kosher, and asking what sorts of pains they have and what do they not like about the current tools, and so on and so forth. And that'll help you work towards potential niches. All right, and that is going to do it. Once again, thank you for watching. I do hope that you've enjoyed this slightly modified format where I'm a little bit better prepared here. I will have down in the description down below, I'm still going to have the timestamps and all that good stuff, but this is just hopefully a value add for you. So let me go into my little spiel here at the end. If you like this video and you want to catch more of them, I would love it if you would give me a subscribe. And if you do that, don't forget to click the bell. That will let you know when new videos come out. If you liked this video, I would love a like. It actually does help the channel. That's not just like some stuff that I say. But if you disliked the video and you want to let me know that, give it a thumbs down as well. I don't want dishonest feedback. I'm really not trying to fluff anything here. I just want to know what you think, and I can tune and get better accordingly. So I will wrap by saying, as always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.